2000s, cannabis caregivers and patients quickly learned of the incredible benefits that CBD had on an array of ailments because it interacted so effectively with the endocannabinoid system. When I speak to patient groups around the country, there is usually someone in the group who has some version of, how can CBD help so many medical problems? You talk about it like it's a magical potion. And it's true that the list of physical problems that CBD helps with seems unrealistic, but I tell folks that CBD really only helps one thing. It supports and strengthens the endocannabinoid system. The healing gained is because the endocannabinoid system is the body's master regulator for all the major systems. So, if you help the master regulator, you keep your body more in balance and lessen the impact of a wide range of ailments simply because you have gassed up the regulating mechanism and it can now do its job more effectively. With the popularity of CBD, new research is now just beginning into several other novel cannabinoids, including CBG, cannabigerol. And CBG2 acts system-wide through the endocannabinoid system in similar ways as CBD. CBG has many benefits for folks looking to get relief. And today we're going to dig into the first scientific survey of what ailments patients are using CBG to relieve. If you want to learn about cannabis health, cultivation, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we are giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. This month, we are giving away the entire Vashon Kush series from Farmer Fly Selections. 10 lucky winners will receive one randomized pack of these 10 new Vashon Kush crosses. To learn more about what the crosses are in the drop, check out at farmer_fly on Instagram. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive the newsletter. So go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest today is Dr. Ethan Russo. Dr. Ethan Russo is a board-certified neurologist and former senior medical advisor to GW Pharmaceuticals. He served as study physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for 3 phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex. He has held faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana, in medicine at the University of Washington, and as visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He has been president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and is former chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicine. In 1995, he pursued a 3-month sabbatical doing ethnobotanical research with indigenous people in Peru. He is author of several books of cannabis medicine and has published over 30 articles in neurology, pain management, cannabis, and ethnobotany.
Recruits needed, sir.
Dr. Russo has joined us before on Shaping Fire. Episode 22 on treating traumatic brain injury with cannabis and mushrooms, and episodes 11 and 27 about his famous research papers on cannabinoids and terpenoids. Episode number 67 about treating migraines with mushrooms and cannabis. Recently on episode 80 to talk about his new paper on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and of course the 10-part video series Shaping Fire Sessions on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel. Today we offer Dr. Russo's very first public interview on the results of his groundbreaking paper out this week titled Survey of Patients Employing Cannabigerol Predominant Cannabis Preparations, Perceived Medical Effects, Adverse Events, and Withdrawal Symptoms. Welcome to the show, Ethan.
Good to be back.
Right on. So we're going to talk mostly about this new comprehensive survey that you and your co-authors have published. But before we do that, let's spend the first set in talking specifically about CBG so that everybody understands a little more significantly the impact of the survey when we get to it. So, while CBG is only really getting popular now, when did we first discover and isolate cannabigerol and knew that it existed?
Well, that goes clear back to 1964. As with many other items pertinent to cannabis and cannabinoid science, Professor Meshulam was there with his partner, Yechiel Gaoni, who died I think 3 years ago at about age 90. But they isolated cannabigerol in 1964 from hashish that was seized by the government, and it was of Lebanese origin. But even then, as is so often the case, Professor Meshulam was very prescient about what might happen, and he called cannabigerol the missing link in the plant synthesis of cannabinoid constituents. So he knew right away that this was sort of the mother of all cannabinoids, was the precursor to the rest, and that turned out to be absolutely correct.
So what is the reason that he determined it was the mother of cannabinoids?
Well, in looking at the chemistry, it seemed that other things would be derived from it, and I imagine that this was based on the structure. But certainly, I don't know how he did it, but he turned out to be right, as in so many things.
So it was discovered. Dr. Meshulam realizes that this is a significant discovery, and then all of a sudden they're like, there's this big period where there's not a lot of research. What do we attribute that to? Is that directly related to prohibition, or was like nobody really interested?
Well, combination of a couple of things. First was prohibition. By this time, cannabis was already illegal most places, and then more formally so with the Single Convention Treaty, which followed a few years later. But the main reason was all the bandwidth was taken up by THC. And because in initial studies, which took place in 1969, they started giving cannabigerol to dogs, monkeys, mice, and rats, and didn't see any really overt behavioral changes, and so it just didn't get any attention until much later.
So back in the days like that, they would have been giving them CBG isolate, correct, and not in the company of other cannabinoids?
Yeah, very likely. Of course, there'd be small amounts that might be present if someone were using hashish or other forms of cannabis, but one of the quirks, and this could be another reason that it wasn't studied so much, normally CBG doesn't accumulate much in cannabis plants. It sort of is a high throughput stop on the way to the other cannabinoids. In other words, as soon as it's made, most frequently the plant goes on to THC or CBD. But now with selective breeding, that situation is changing, and we'll get to that more later, I'm sure.
For sure we are. And when you, so what do you mean high throughput stoppage, I think is how you put it?
Well, again, so there are enzymes that result in the production of cannabigerol, or actually cannabigerolic acid, which is what the plant makes before decarboxylation, the loss of CO2 molecule. But again, normally it doesn't stop there. There are more enzymes that will lead to production of THC and CBD. And so in most cannabis samples, when they're analyzed, you see either no CBG or very small amounts, well under 1%.
So one of the things that we know about, the variety of cannabinoids that have been researched is that they work on different receptors in different ways, which kind of suggests what they might be used for. What are the different actions and receptors that CBG acts on, and is it similar to any of the other cannabinoids?
No, it's really distinct. I mean, there are some overlaps in terms of the things that it seems to be good for, which we'll talk about later. But straight out of the chute, it's important to mention that CBG does not seem to work directly on the cannabinoid receptors, at least not CB1 and CB2, which are normally associated with THC. So it's true to say that it is not intoxicating or doesn't produce a high the way that THC does. And again, again, early on that led to less interest. Now I think it leads to more interest because of all the benefits it can have therapeutically without the possible downside of intoxication, because being high, as you know, is considered a side effect according to the FDA. But to answer your question, it does work on adrenoreceptors, alpha-2 adrenoreceptors, and this may have something to do with its effects on pain. Additionally, it's an antagonist at what's called the TRPM8 receptor, which makes it a good candidate for a number of things, particularly treatment of prostate cancer, but also overactive bladder, and a variety of other things. And then there are lots of other activities where all of it hasn't been worked out. Its activity at CB1 and CB2 is much, much less than THC. But beyond that, and all these mechanisms aren't clear yet, but back in 2008, Giovanni Appendino and his colleagues discovered that CBG is very powerful as an antibiotic against gram-positive bacteria, and that includes MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, which is associated with hospital-acquired infections, and some years ago was responsible for a lot of deaths.
So, as far as the excuse me. As far as the fact that we haven't really had consistent access to CBG until we've developed these more CBG dominant plants, most folks that I talk to kind of generally have the belief that land races had wide-ranging varieties of cannabinoids until they became heavily bred for the THC market, and it is that breeding for THC that you mentioned that bred the CBG out because it was taking up space in the resin gland that could be holding THC instead. Have you seen much evidence, either through your research or through your work with Breeders Best, that there were CBG dominant land races prior to us starting to breed it for THC heavily?
Great question. I don't know that we know that. What I can say is that where people have been growing with regenerative agriculture, real soil, active mycorrhizae, natural bacteria in the soil, they're seeing a greater diversity of cannabinoid production, including CBG. So in other words, chemovars, chemical varieties that previously were primarily THC or CBD, seem to be expressing more different cannabinoids, including CBG, when they're grown in this fashion. So the premise of your question is a real possibility. Part of the problem is we don't know, didn't have great analytical capabilities going back to the early 70s when there were more land races available. And as I'm sure you're aware, a lot of those have been supplanted by seeds from California and the Netherlands. And so it's getting harder to find some of the old land races. But that's a great topic for future research. Something I'd like to be able to answer better in the future.
Yeah, it is disappointing that so many of those original landrace populations have been infected by worked over lines from the West. I do hope that people put more effort into saving those land races. And as a side note, I find that very interesting too, that you're finding the expression of CBG and the other various cannabinoids is more prevalent in living soil. And from the other episodes that we've done, that would make sense too, right? If the plant has got a wider relationship with the soil, and the plant is sharing exudates with the microbe life in the rhizosphere, allowing a wider variety of life, thus feeding the plant from below all those delightful excretions in the living soil, it would make sense that the plant has got more raw material to express itself more wildly, which is, why plants that are grown in soil have got a wider terpene profile than otherwise. That's really interesting. So that it would make sense that folks who are growing intentionally for CBG would want to strongly consider soil. All right, that's interesting. Thank you for that. CBG is often called a novel or minor cannabinoid, and in most cases that seems to be synonymous with not studied much, right? Do those words novel or minor cannabinoid have any relevance in science?
Well, novel is a misnomer. Minor really refers to the fact that we usually don't see a lot of it, and again, that's a situation we'd like to change. I really think that CBG is the next big thing, and maybe in the future we're not referring to it as a minor cannabinoid.
Right. So there's a case to be made that really the words novel and minor are more of a layman's terms and not actually all that legit. All right.
Novel to me just means, I hadn't heard of that one so much yet. But again, a situation that we need to change.
Yeah, exactly. So I was surprised to read in your paper that CBG actually often occurs, or maybe not often, but occurs elsewhere in nature other than in cannabis. Would you please teach us a bit about that?
Yeah, not widely. Clear back in 1979, there was an article that was published in German from a German group, and they were looking at so-called South African daisy, Helichrysum umbraculagirum, and they found small amounts of both cannabigerolic acid and cannabigerol in the plant, and it was mainly an analytical article. But when you really dig, it gets interesting because this plant and related species in the genus were sometimes smoked by indigenous people in South Africa. There's not a lot of detail about the effects, but presumably there was some psychoactive effect, and Europeans would often look at this and claim that these things were smoked as a tobacco substitute. In other words, when people didn't have tobacco to smoke, they'd smoke these other things, but I think that that's culturally myopic, let's say. I think that my suspicion is that it had an anti-anxiety effect, and that's why it was being smoked, and we've got some evidence for that now. But the amounts were small. This was an article that I knew of and actually paid to have it translated into English because I'm not a German reader. But again, it didn't provide a lot of detail about the uses. Subsequently, my colleague Mark Lewis looked at some plants that we germinated. It was very hard to get seeds. But he really found only tiny amounts, and it's unlikely without a tremendous amount of selective breeding that you could get significant concentrations of these molecules from that species. It makes a lot more sense to selectively breed cannabis, where we can do a lot better these days in cannabigerol production.
So in the second set, we're going to talk more about, what people are reporting in the modern day as human users of cannabis. But before your survey, the largest survey of users that has occurred, looking backwards, we were looking at animal studies primarily, and there were some suspicions of what we were going to find the positive uses of it are. So would you do a review of what we were suspecting when we headed towards studying human use because of what we've learned from the animal studies?
Yeah, again, so the early studies, they just didn't see a lot of overt behavioral changes. But then there was some work showing benefit on pain reduction. There were studies that showed decreasing of the intraocular pressure, much as THC can do. There were effects to reduce reddening that were associated with inflammation. More interesting were some cytotoxic effects, in other words, effects against cancer. And that was true in what's called epithelioid carcinoma, and then again in prostate cancer. And breast cancer, there was also a prominent response. There was some rodent work done showing an antidepressant effect. There was a reduction of cells called keratinocytes that are present excessively in psoriasis, so that indicated possible use there. And let's see, what else? An interesting one is CpG also works on another receptor, a nuclear receptor that affects gene transcription called PPAR gamma. And in experiments that were done a couple of years ago, they were shown to be a neuroprotective effect on inflammation. And also effects on another agent called tumor necrosis factor alpha that's involved in autoimmune disorders. So it opens up a lot of possibilities. Finally, there was a recent study just this year in glioblastoma multiforme showing that basically cannabigerol could kill that kind of cell. So, again, very promising, particularly since, without giving anything away, I can say that cannabigerol is a very non-toxic substance. Likely we could give large amounts of it, and to be able to treat cancer successfully without introducing a lot of other toxicities, in other words, side effects, is going to be a real boon in the future, because currently available chemotherapy agents are generally toxic. In other words, you hope that you kill the cancer before you kill too many of the patient's normal cells, and this is why standard chemotherapy is associated with loss of hair follicles and sloughing of the gut, and cannabigerol and other cannabinoids pretend to be much safer as chemotherapeutic agents. So that part's very exciting.
I'm curious what you mean using the term that's relative. You can give much more CBG, right? For many folks, a regular dose is going to be somewhere between probably 10 and 20 milligrams, maybe down to 5, but probably 10 to 20. So when you say much more, what are you actually saying milligrams wise?
Well, with some of the cannabinoids, it may be necessary to have hundreds of milligrams a day. So far at least, and I don't want anyone pressing their luck, but we've got so little indication of toxicity from the information we have, it's very likely that those kind of high doses could be given without the kinds of drawbacks that we find with huge doses of THC, where certainly people can attain them, but often they have to do it by titrating upwards over a period of time, as much as 2 weeks. So that remains to be seen, but from what we know so far, my strong suspicion is that high doses of CBG will be tolerable to people that might need higher doses to treat cancer primarily.
Yeah, I've worked with patients that are taking as much as 250 a day, and they certainly don't seem to have any negative side effects unless not having any anxiety is a side effect. But so this last question before we go to the break, it's a little personal, but I think that it's called for regarding what you've just said about the history of this. As a research scientist who also has worked in a general general practice so that you are used to interacting with real humans who are really suffering, and you're not just only in the lab where people are sometimes less connected to the patient. How do you feel about the frustration of having your hands tied for so long and being able to research something that you just stated we've had really good ideas that is going to help people for so long, but no one's really had the opportunity to touch it, and now having that opportunity increasing? I mean, as someone who's a lifelong researcher for you, it must be somehow like a frustrating opportunity.
Well, I think frustration is my middle name where cannabis comes in, because this has been my life for 25 years. But frankly, the situation with prohibition on cannabigerol is outrageous. It's scandalous and scientifically untenable. This is not a drug of abuse. I'm certain that when drug abuse liability studies are done, they're just not going to find a signal here. It could be that it's one of the solutions to addiction, but it won't be a cause of addiction. So it's guilt by association. It happens to come from a plant that also happens to make THC, which similarly shouldn't be prohibited. So it is an outrageous situation, and the longer it goes on, the greater the tragedy will be compounded.
Are you seeing that the ability to do this kind of research has been eased? I mean, you've told me just in passing, that even doing this survey is hard, and you're just asking questions. What is the state of play as far as doing CBG studies?
Technically, CBG is a Schedule 1 forbidden substance, and people could be arrested for it under federal law. That has not changed. Irrespective of the fact that it's legal in many states, it would be possible for people to be prosecuted just for having this stuff. So that hasn't changed, and the roadblocks to research remain essentially no different substantially from what I experienced back in the 90s.
Jeez. So, that's the frustrating opportunity, right?
Yeah, well, another reason I've worked for foreign companies for most of the past 25 years.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I'm excited to hear what the survey shows us, but let's go ahead and get the first commercial break out of the way. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. Cannabis folks are innovators and problem solvers, and we like to make money. Have you developed a tool, technique, or plant that you want to protect and monetize? You'll likely want legal representation that is experienced, accessible, and shares your values. Plant and Planet Law represents a wide variety of clients who choose to respect the environment while pursuing their business goals. Have you invented a machine or gizmo that you're bringing to market? Did you discover a breakthrough environmentally friendly pesticide or fertilizer formulation that you're about to start selling? Have you bred a cannabis plant with attributes not found anywhere else? Attorney Dale Hunt and his Plant and Planet team have established genetic patents in over 30 countries. Working to help entrepreneur scientists throughout the life sciences, Plant and Planet represents environmentally positive clients in cannabis and other botanicals, fungi, water purification, clean energy, emulsions, and medical applications. Plant and Planet helps people protect what they've created. If you are an early-stage company with an established idea and are in the process of fundraising, often the investors require intellectual property protections happen at the same time. Plant and Planet can be your sole representation, or they can integrate with your existing legal team and plug in their specialties. Plant and Planet is made of scientists, lawyers with a real passion for cannabis, inventions, and the environment. They have the scientific and legal depth to help you establish patent protections for your great idea. You don't have to go it alone. Friendly, qualified, and honorable legal representation is available to you. Contact Plant and Planet Law today to start the conversation. Email info@plantandplanet.com. That's Plant and Planet Law. Our clients make the planet better.
Esküszöm, azt
For
én
years,
haltam meg.
organic cultivators have been looking for a replacement for using peat moss. Peat moss has long been the go-to soil amendment for water retention and container growing, but organic growers know that peat moss is an unsustainable resource, and the mining of peat bogs destroys habitat and releases sequestered carbon. But peat moss works so well that many have continued to use it. But now there's finally a revolutionary replacement for peat moss that shares the same benefits while also being sustainable. Pit moss sounds and acts like peat moss, but instead of being mined from fragile ecosystems, it actually is made from upcycled organic paper and tree bark. Pit moss is excellent at retaining water in your substrate and creating air pockets and tiny living environments for microbes. Pit moss instantly increases aeration, nutrient absorption, and water conservation too. Carefully and locally sourced, pit moss is the result of decades-long research into the use of recycled paper fibers. Pit moss has the fluffy nature of peat moss and handles exactly the same. And like peat moss, pit moss is inert, so it won't change your pH. Available in a range of preparations, including a nutrient-enhanced blend, a cocoa coir blend, and also as an organic soil conditioner with no added nutrients. Pit moss is also available as an animal bedding. So go to pitmoss.com now to learn more. That's PITTMOSS.com. Growing healthier, more sustainable plants. Pit moss. One of the reasons why no-till cannabis growing is so valued by farmers is because the mycelium networks in the soil remain established from year to year. And we know these fungal networks are essential because they are the nutrient superhighways that extend far and wide in the substrate to feed your plants. The trouble with growing in new living soils or blended cocoa substrates is that it takes most of the plant's life just to create these mycelium highways. Dinomyco endomycorrhizal fungi inoculant reduces that time and gets your plant eating a wider array of nutrients faster. And it's 3 times the concentration of the other popular brand in the US at 900 propagules per gram of 2 fungal species selected specifically for cannabis cultivation. Dinomyco is the result of 30 years of research and trials at the Volcani Agriculture Research Institute in Israel. It has also been vigorously trialed by cannabis and food growers across the US. Dinomyco is now available at grow shops and on Amazon in the United States. I love using Dinomyco to both speed up the growth of the mycelium networks in the soil, but also as a biostimulant to make clone cuttings more virile. You can see side-by-sides showing the comparative growth on their Instagram at Dinomyco. If you demand reliable growing results and appreciate the importance of an active root zone in creating a thriving plant, I encourage you to check out dinomyco.com and use the store locator to find out where you can get yours. That's DYNOMYCO.com. Shaping Fire listeners can get 10% off any size of Dinomyco on Amazon or dinomyco.com by using the discount code SHAPINGFIRE, one word, no caps. Whether you are starting with new beds or pots, or if you want to add some zing to tired soil, choose Dinomyco to maximize your plant's potential. Dinomyco endomycorrhizal inoculant. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. So during this set, we're going to focus specifically on this survey with a title that is a mouthful. So here it is. The title of the paper is Survey of Patients Employing Cannabigerol, Predominant Cannabis Preparations, Perceived Medical Effects, Adverse Effects, and Withdrawal Symptoms. So, you pretty much know what the agenda is here in the second set. So, Ethan, you got a handful of co-authors on this study, and everyone put in hard work. So, I'd like us to take the opportunity to give them a nod, if you would.
Sure. Well, this was a real labor of love and involved 3 universities as well as Credo Science. It was my idea to do this. But I immediately wanted to enlist the help of Carrie Cutler in the Department of Psychology at Washington State University, who was fantastic in putting this together and really implementing the survey, which we decided what to ask jointly. But a lot of that work was also informed by Michelle Sexton at the University of California, San Francisco. We also enlisted the aid of another great researcher, Ziva Cooper at UCLA, and grad student Amanda Stoiber, who works with Carrie, was involved, as well as my business partner, Nisha Whiteley at Credo Science. So I had the great fortune to be involved with 5 wonderful women in doing this study, and it all went very smoothly from our standpoint.
Who funded this study?
Well, basically, essentially, Carrie and the rest volunteered their time. Same with us at Credo Science. We offered 2 gift cards as an incentive to participation. That cost me personally $100.
The people who were recruited, you paid for the raffle everybody was in?
Yes.
That's
sure.
funny. I assumed that since this was being done in cooperation with universities, that the way it always happens is that the university foots the bill for everything. But I guess that's an incorrect understanding on my part.
Well, it generally would be. Clearly, Carrie and other people work through grants, but sometimes the grants offer latitude in how you spend your time. This was not funded by the National Institutes of Health directly or anything like that.
All right. Well, then let's move right into the survey. I'm just going to kind of like hand you the mic because so that you can go through your notes. Would you explain for us how the survey was set up and operated?
Sure. Well, first, the study was exempted from what's called the Institutional Review Board. They looked at it and decided that we weren't going to do anything that would interfere with the anonymity of participants or expose them to the legal problems. So we had free rein to take people through this. And we recruited people online with listservs, social media, and some personal contacts, and had some help there. A survey was placed online, and there were certain things we wanted to see. To avoid issues, we made it adults only, age 21 or up. They had to be an American resident. And they had to, and this was the important part, they had to be using a cannabigerol predominant product, meaning at least 50% CBG in the past 6 months. And then we asked a bunch of questions and analyzed those statistically. In terms of the demographics, 166 people started, but 127 completed, and that's not unusual. People get bored or decide they don't want to do it for some reason. It was about 34% males and 40% females, predominantly Caucasian, some diversity. There was a range of income and education, but unlike some surveys of medical use of cannabis, where there are a lot of people who are disabled or unemployed, the majority of the people who took part were working. The first thing we examined was the use patterns for the cannabigerol predominant products. People had averaged taking these for a little bit over 9 months, so it wasn't, I tried it once and this is what happened. We thought we had a better foundation of information. When people were using flower, they averaged about 3.5 grams of CBG per week. And for people who are using concentrates, it was about 1 gram of CBG concentrates per week. Then we wanted to know why people took it. In other words, what conditions were they treating? And actually, there were probably, I didn't count, There must have been 40 or 50 things that were mentioned, and some people had more than one. But the point being that over half, 51.2%, were using CBG for medical purposes. Only 6.3% characterized their use as recreational, and about 36.2% called it both. So this is a common situation. Certainly one could argue that all use has a medical basis, but that's how people judge this themselves. The most common conditions that were cited by the population involved were anxiety, 51.2%, chronic pain, which was 40.9%, depression, 33.1%, and insomnia, difficulty sleeping, in 30.7%. And again, this is all based on 127 people who completed the survey, and again, were using cannabidiol predominant products. The next thing we wanted to examine was how did they compare cannabidiol with conventional medicines that might be used to treat the same conditions. Well, first of all, they seem to think that this worked pretty well. Majority of the conditions, people said that they were much or very much improved as compared to prior to taking cannabidiol. The highest efficacy was associated with endometriosis, a gynecological condition, 66.7% cited that as being helpful. Then one I didn't necessarily expect, inflammatory bowel disease, 75%, and irritable bowel syndrome, 82.4%. So clearly people with gastrointestinal issues found this quite helpful. Now, what's really interesting to me was not a single person thought that conventional medicine was superior to CBG for these various conditions.
Wow, not a single person. That's extreme.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder. And I'm sure that some people probably think, oh, again, it's a psychoactive effect. They're high, but they weren't high. So it's not the usual disclaimer that you sometimes hear about in relation to THC. They're high and they don't care about their condition anymore. So that's clearly just not the case. Another measure of efficacy of a medicine is what does it allow you to stop? In other words, were people discontinuing conventional medicines? There were a significant number of people who discontinued conventional medicine because of their use of CBG. This is particularly true for antidepressant meds, the non-opioid analgesics, so that would include things like non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and also protein pump inhibitors. So, they'd be used by people who had ulcers or that kind of problem. So again, we've got the gut. Seemingly a lot of affinity there for that kind of problem. We're, again, one of the main reasons we did this is finding out what it's good for. And frankly, we wanted to establish this because I expect that CBG and CBG predominant products eventually are going to be going into clinical trials, and we have to establish a pattern, number one, of what's it good for, and number two, is it safe? And certainly that was one of the primary reasons we wanted to do this survey, to lay a foundation for future more in-depth randomized controlled trials.
That's an interesting idea, especially with how you described the legal environment for trying to do this sort of research, that if I understand you correctly, you kind of had to do this study first so that you can now go back to the well and do a more complex, deeper study, because without this study, you would not be able to get a heavier duty study even approved.
Yeah, certainly true. So I can relate a story. Believe it or not, it was not that many years ago that my colleague Donald Abrams wanted to do a study looking at inhaled cannabidiol, CBD. And the first reaction from the FDA was, well, we don't have a record of human use in this fashion. Which really wasn't true. CBD had been extensively investigated as part of Sativex and Abiximols in clinical trials. And we knew all we needed to know about its safety for humans. But basically, he had to put together information showing that CBD was extensively available in California and elsewhere, and that hundreds of thousands of people were using it with no major problems, and then he was able to proceed with the research. Well, you know, you have to look at these things and wonder what's going to happen the next round with the next new quote-unquote cannabinoid, and I really anticipated that there would be pushback about proposed CBG studies. Normally, say drug's really new, a new chemical entity, something you synthesize in the lab. The normal procedure is to test it in animals and do advanced toxicology studies where huge amounts are given to rats and or dogs, and then if there are no major problems, you get to give it to people. Well, this is cannabis. Again, the amounts of CBG in the past were probably low, but again, we wanted to establish a pattern of use by humans without apparent problems, so that we hopefully will not face the same kind of resistance.
Did you have a difficulty finding, you know, the 166 people who started, but then like the 127 that finished? You know, as somebody who works closely with CBG, I know that finding, you know, CBG dominant products or flower that are 51% or more CBG, that's very rare. You know, that's not a common thing. Was it? What did you find as far as like being able to recruit people who had access to that? Was that a challenge?
Well, you know, most of the people came from the Northwest. This has really been the area in the world where there's been the most intensive cultivation of CBG predominant varieties and the greatest interest in its therapeutic use. It didn't take us forever to do this. I think it was just a few months. So I was quite gratified with that. And the other thing was we had very good contacts in trying to do this. You know, among others, we sent this to our colleagues that see the greatest number of patients for cannabis recommendations, and a lot of them are accessing CBG predominant products, and it came together nicely.
It's interesting that you mentioned that it's prevalent most in the Pacific Northwest, or for the interest. Was there anything that came up in the research that give you anything to attribute that for? I mean, my only bet would be because the Crawford brothers are in Oregon, and that's my best bet.
Well, they've been the prime movers for sure, but there are other breeders that have independently bred CBG predominant varieties, and interest has increased. But yeah, we in the Northwest are really at the center of interest in this compound.
Interesting. So I asked this question not as an indictment, simply as a neutral question, but how should we weigh the scientific validity of self-reporting in this case, right? I don't know a lot about conducting scientific research, but self-reporting sounds like something that should be at least considered for accuracy. But I know it counts as actual science. So how can we think about that?
Well, you know, in the hierarchy of medical proof, a survey doesn't get a lot of credence. However, in this instance, we had good numbers, We had specificity with, again, not the idea that 1% CBG was present. These were CBG predominant products being used. Additionally, we saw consistency in the results. And, you know, it would be different if this were something that people took because they liked it. In other words, where people could claim that, well, you know, people use regular cannabis because they like THC and like being high. That just wasn't the case here. Also, we had consistency in the side effects. We've talked about the good. We need to include the bad, such as it was. But as it turned out, there wasn't a lot to say. 44% of people in the survey reported no adverse events. In other words, no significant side effects. Most common were things that might have been due to THC that was in some of the preparations. So dry mouth, sleepiness, increased appetite, and dry eyes, all of which could have been THC induced. Interestingly, although we were asking about adverse events, 10% reported of other side benefits. But when we look at the list, it's not an extensive list. People were not reporting anything really dangerous like paranoia or hallucinations. And we also wanted to ask about withdrawal. Say you've been taking this for a while, what happened when you stopped? But 84.3% reported no withdrawal symptoms of any kind. There were very, very few who reported sleep difficulties when they quit, as compared to non-CBG predominant cannabis, in other words, garden variety cannabis. There were very marked statistically significant differences. In other words, when people stopped, they had many fewer issues, if any, as compared to other types of cannabis. So it's clear again, this isn't addictive. It's not getting people high. It's not producing significant withdrawal.
I have got a quick question about the definition of withdrawal. I'm a regular CBG user, and it does a wonderful job decreasing my anxiety and softening my ADHD. However, when I haven't had it for a few days, some of the sharper edges of those aspects of me come out, and so it's not that I'm having withdrawal symptoms from the supplement. It's because without the supplement, my brain's a lot clankier, right? What's a definitional difference between withdrawal and just missing the cannabis?
Yeah. Well, you've asked the exactly right question. There's a difference between withdrawal and a recrudescence, a reappearance of symptoms that were present before. So withdrawal would be more the idea of something's worse than it was before, or something that wasn't there at all before. Withdrawal and other drugs, would also lead to craving. We didn't hear about craving to speak of, or behavior, obsessive behavior to reacquire the material. The things that one would associate with, say, opioid addiction, where people unfortunately turn to crime to obtain it. Nothing like that. And no pink elephants or things we associate with alcohol, no DTs, etc.
So, of the people, I know you've already given us the numbers of the people who thought that the cannabis was more effective for their ailment than the pharmaceutical treatments that they were taking. Was there any sense of how many people you know, they had an opportunity to have CBG and they saw it worked and they were not interested in the pharmaceutical, but then they couldn't find more because CBG seems to still be spotty, right, in the market.
Yeah. I'm afraid we just don't have that kind of information yet. And again, hopefully supplies will be available in the future and this won't be a problem. But, you know, again, from a scientific point of view, we're looking at this as a foundation towards much more sophisticated studies that are going to be in the upper reaches of that hierarchy of medical proof. Basically, anything short of a randomized controlled trial with comparative placebo is not given a lot of credence by physicians or the Food and Drug Administration. So that's what we're going to need to really prove, if you will, that this is going to be a valuable medicine.
Well, that's a beautiful transition, Ethan. Thank you. Because during the third set, we're going to talk about looking forward for the future of CBG and how best we folks can use it. So let's go ahead and take our second short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. As cannabis regulations become more demanding and consumers become more educated, it is increasingly important to avoid the use of chemical pesticides when cultivating cannabis. Beneficial insects have been used for decades by the greenhouse vegetable and ornamental plant industry, and today many cannabis cultivators are moving from sprays and chemicals to beneficial insects. Copert Biological Systems has the beneficial insects, mites, and nematodes, microbials, sticky cards, and air distribution units you need to partner with nature to defend your garden. Whether you manage acres of canopy or have a simple grow tent in your home, Copert is ready to help answer your questions and help you transition away from chemical sprays towards clean and natural solutions. Since 1967, Copert has assisted growers in identifying pests and devising reliable solutions while providing healthy insects and mites that will protect your yield. Since the 1990s, Copert has been a leader in cannabis pest and disease control worldwide and have highly trained consultants to assist you in Canada and the US from coast to coast. No matter where you live, Copert Biological Systems can help. Visit Copert.com, choose your country, and get detailed information. That's Copert, Koppert.com. For the most up-to-date cannabis-related biological control information, you can also check out their Instagram, @CopertCanada. You know getting away from pesticides is good for health and good for business, and Copert is ready to help. Visit Koppert.com today. For 20 years, Humboldt Seed Company has been family-owned and providing reliable, high-yielding seeds originating in Northern California. While the current trend is to slap one super male into a line of hype strains, Humboldt Seed Company continues to breed with precision and care by doing large sifts and back crosses to emphasize the absolute best traits that a line has to offer. This kind of breeding takes time, talent, and space to work. No matter what kind of aroma you are particularly into, Humboldt Seed will likely have something you'll love. If you love fruit, you can choose from banana, mango, apricot, papaya, blueberry, blood orange, melon, and lemons across their various strains. They have all gas, glue, and classic sour diesel lines as well. Of course, there are the heritage California strains like OG Kush, Jack Hare, and Headband, and their award-winning Blueberry Muffin is one that delights just about everybody's palate, especially when concentrated. Humboldt Seed Company is proud to bring to market the infamous Freak Show Cultivar 2, which has a great THC high, but looks so much like a fern that some folks can't even identify it as cannabis. It's a plant that really needs to be seen to be believed. If you're looking for well-balanced CBD seeds, Humboldt Seed Company can turn you on to CBD strains that actually have flavor, like the dill and pepper terpenes of Willie G's Lebanese landrace. Whether you are looking for regular, feminized, or autoflowers, Humboldt Seed Company has the gear to make this your best growing cycle ever. Visit HumboldtSeedCompany.com today to check out their line of vigorous genetics, download their catalog, and find out where you can pick them up. You can also check out their Instagram at The Humboldt Seed Company to check out their gorgeous flowers and the extraordinary freak show plant. Humboldt Seed Company. Let them know Shango sent you. With the National Hemp Program in flux due to stringent THC testing requirements, brothers Seth and Eric Crawford continue to release seeds to hemp farmers that will be legal, no matter how you grow them or when you test them. These new varieties from Oregon CBD Seeds have substantial amounts of CBDV, CBGV, CBCV, and THCV, while always staying below the 0.3% THC limit and guaranteeing compliant crops for farmers every time. Also, these new varieties cannot be pollinated by your neighbor's uncontrolled pollen or a rogue male in your own crop either. Oregon CBD Seeds are non-GMO certified too. Oregon CBD Seeds was founded and funded in 2015 by Seth and Eric, maxing out their personal credit cards without outside investment. They continue to refuse outside investment that would change their company culture. Oregon CBD grows tons of fresh food on their research farms for local food banks, literally tons of food. They also give away tens of thousands of pounds of R&D flour to patients. As their company began to succeed, Seth and Eric started donating money to the cannabis medicine and hemp fiber cause too, by giving millions of dollars to Oregon State University in order to establish the world's leading cannabis genomics research program. And they treat their employees right. Oregon CBD pays for full health and dental coverage for their employees, a 401k program, and their minimum starting wage is $20 an hour. Plus, everyone shares food from the farms. Seth has been on Shaping Fire a few times to talk about novel cannabinoids. You can check out episodes 25 and 37 on CBD cultivars and the hemp market, episode 66 on triploid cannabis genetics, and the very first Shaping Fire Live, episode 47, with Seth and soil expert Jeff Lowenfels talking about autoflowers. If you are a hemp farmer and you want to grow reliable seeds that are sure to thrive in past testing, check out OregonCBDSeeds.com to learn more about buying seeds for the 2021 season. That's OregonCBDSeeds.com. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and our guest this week is cannabis researcher and neurologist, Dr. Ethan Russo. So let's take a look forward. You know, during the first set, we got a better understanding of what CBG is and a bit about how it is functioning in the human. And then during the second set, you know, we essentially talked to like 127 people to find out how CBG is helping them live better lives and get off of their pharmaceuticals with, increased side effects. So that's all great. And we've already also talked about how the environment for research for CBG is opening, but there's still all these hoops you've got to go through. I'm curious right now, what areas are showing promise looking forward? Because I know there are college and graduate students and citizen scientists and others who are constantly looking for the promise in cannabinoids, and perhaps we can either motivate them or direct them in ways that are most likely to bear fruit. So the survey measured the prior use of the participants and their continued need for 13 different classes of medications that they appeared to be linked with CBG. And you talked about that a little bit already, saying that there were a lot of people who preferred it to their pharma, and B, because they knew it, they believed it worked. What are the classes of these 13 different medications? Because it would seem to point where we should look at for shorter term success.
Sure. Well, once again, the best signal were for non-opioid pain relievers. With the opioids, it wasn't a highly statistically significant effect. So it would be a little different from the claims that we hear associated with, say, THC predominant cannabis. But probably, I think the most important one here is antidepressants. So there was a p-value, probability value, 0.02. Anything below 0.05 is considered statistically significant for medical purposes. So that one's really interesting. But I would say that considering the big number of conditions that we saw listed, that there are probably many other areas that beyond those where this would be fruitful. Again, we can go back to the basic science and really see where the signals are. So, if the question would be what is going to be promising for future indications, I think we have answers already.
So, as far as like the how many people, what I'm going to is market attraction, right? Because one of the interesting aspects of the paper is that, towards the end, it's all, there's accessibility and its potential future in pharmaceuticals, but really the fastest mover right now is the cannabis market and people's interests in cannabis with, what we're calling novel cannabinoids, right? So, as far as the statistics go, does this look like something that is going to be desired by everybody? Because on its face, to me, it does. How did it bear out in the numbers?
Well, again, it's hard to say. When a new thing comes along, there's always somebody that's going to suggest we should put it in the water. I'm not going to go that far. However, I do see certain areas that are preeminent here. As I'm sure you've heard from your contacts, this seems to be a remarkable treatment for anxiety. And what really distinguishes it from other drugs is that it does this without being overtly sedating. Most anti-anxiety agents are going to be quite sedating. Many are addictive. Clearly, CBG is not either of those things. And I've also heard people say something to me that's very profound in relation to its use in treating anxiety, and that is its ability to allow them to compartmentalize. What that means is, whatever was bothering them, they know it's there, but they can put it aside and concentrate on the tasks at hand. In other words, just not let it pervasively interfere with their functioning. To me, that's the definition of a good drug for anxiety, allowing people to function better.
I'd like to add a little color to that as well. And I like the way that you put that. When I hear about that same attribute from patients, they talk about it being, they feel like they've got an increased capability, that their life struggles or challenges or pain have not decreased, but somehow they feel like they're able to handle it, like they have the capability to meet the difficulty of the issue, and in a way that's them being able to compartmentalize it so that they can they can handle it more. Were there other varieties of anxiety that you saw pop up?
Gee, not we just survey could not have that level of detail. I think that would come from patient narratives, and that's something we'll have to supplement in the future.
Right on, that makes sense. For folks that are listening and are curious, the other things that I'm seeing just from people taking them, and certainly not at a scientific level and nearly only anecdotal, we're also seeing a decrease in people ruminating, either ruminating first thing in the morning of all the things that could potentially go wrong, or ruminating at night of all the things that potentially did get wrong, and rethinking things, and for others that background anxiety that a lot of people have.
Well, right there, you may have put your finger on how this has been good for sleep, because certainly nobody's going to get to sleep if they're running through all the bad stuff that happened during the day, or all the bad stuff they're facing tomorrow. That's a sleep killer.
We're
right
finding
there.
that a lot of the people who are sensitive to THC and they don't really want to take it at night, because I don't understand the mechanics behind this, but some people who will take as little as 5 or 10 milligrams at night, they describe a hangover of sorts, and they don't care for it. And we've found that a lot of the people who switch over to the CBG, since it doesn't have the THC in the preparation at significant numbers, if you're pulling it from hemp, they're still getting to sleep because the ruminating is gone, but they're not using the THC. So that's a win.
Sure.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts? So you and I have talked actually probably several times on this show about your interest in whole plant compounds as a preference to using lots of isolates. And so we know that your probably top choice would be to have a plant that is bred and grown specifically with a particular blend for a certain set of ailments, and then creating a whole plant oil and then giving that to the patient. However, the market has not developed to the point yet that those preparations really exist, except for small pockets. What are your thoughts on doing with CBG what many people did 5 years ago with CBD, where they would make a whole plant oil? Think of it as like an RSO or a FICO or whatever people call it where they live, but they prepare a whole plant oil and then they spike it with CBG isolate, like people used to spike CBD into a THC RSO. What are your thoughts on that whole range of?
Well, certainly it's a legitimate approach to treating a disorder. We know that CBD also has anti-anxiety properties. The difference being that the doses required for CBD are a lot higher than with CBG. It remains to be seen, but it's a good bet that the combination is going to be more effective. And then there'd be other components, particularly terpenoids, that can contribute here. So certainly the possibilities for experimentation are great. And it is a situation, fortunately, even in development of a pharmaceutical from cannabis, that this kind of blending is allowed. As long as the material is all cannabis derived, that's a legitimate approach. And we know this already because, in fact, Sativex or nabiximols, which is approved in 30 countries, is actually a blend of two different chemovars, a THC predominant chemovar and a CBD predominant chemovar. So the same kind of approach could be used with a CBG predominant chemovar in combination with something else to give the blend that we wish.
A few states, especially the ones that are still medical, are having internal policy discussions about whether or not isolate that has been added to cannabis products should be labeled as such. So the kind of product that we just talked about, an oil, a whole plant oil, if it's been spiked with either CBG or CBD or anything else, that it should be noted on the package that there was isolate added to it, kind of like a fortified with CBG kind of thing. What are your thoughts? Does it matter? Do you think it should be on the label? And if so, why?
Yeah, I believe in truth in advertising. Unfortunately, the industry is not self-policed, and quality control isn't what it really needs to be. And I would always worry about how it was produced, whether it was pure, whether it actually was synthetic rather than derived from cannabis. So all of these things are germane. They're things that I think the consumer deserves to know.
Well, that begs the question. You know, I did a show a while back with Greg Gerdeman about synthetic cannabinoids. Both the creation of cannabinoids that we're familiar with, like THC and CBD, in a synthetic manner, but also the kind of synthetic cannabinoids that are used for testing and research in the lab and don't really have much use outside of the lab. But the way that you answered that question makes me super curious. Does it matter if a cannabinoid, in this case CBG, is from the plant or if it is made through a synthetic process? In the end, it is the same molecule, or no?
Well, it should be, but sometimes these syntheses will produce byproducts that could be contaminants and potentially toxic, so that's always a concern. Also, it has to be the right stereoisomer. In other words, have the right three-dimensional configuration to have the same activity as the natural compound from the plant. So these are all considerations. Ideally, it will all need to be cannabis-derived to produce a pharmaceutical that isn't considered a combination drug. And then in specific states, such as New York, any additions have to be cannabis-derived. That's part of the law there. So I think it is important, and irrespective of what I think, this is going to be a requirement in certain contexts.
Right on. Well, that's interesting. All right, so let's finish this on an upbeat, positive note there, Ethan. So, looking forward, I know that you are very attracted to CBG, and you are already looking at your next work along the same line of thought. Would you give us a little idea of what you're going to be doing next?
Sure. Well, truth be told, I am associated with a company called Andira Pharmaceuticals out of Vancouver, British Columbia, and CBG portends to be a big part of its future. And this would be for two indications that really weren't picked up to any degree in the survey. But these are all based on available past science, and specifically they are treatment of cancer, as we mentioned. There's certain cancers that when they're metastatic, we don't have any current conventional drugs that are able to treat them, but CBG seems to be especially promising in treating prostate cancer and breast cancer, and those are two of the most common cancers that become metastatic and then hard or sometimes impossible to treat. So that's one area, and the other one is antibiotics. We're seeing phenomenal results from the lab in terms of CBG as a treatment for infections, including these antibiotic-resistant infections, MRSA, as I mentioned, but also vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, which is responsible for a lot of hospital-acquired infections and a significant number of deaths. One of the exciting things about that is, so far, from the lab, we don't have any indication that these bacteria will develop resistance to cannabigerol as they do to conventional antibiotics. So this really may be revolutionary. My hope is, again, that we've provided a pattern of human use that indicates safety of these products, which is going to facilitate moving them into the clinic for these specific indications.
I've got this huge smile over here, Ethan, because I was wrapping up the show and I was giving you kind of a fishing question, and then you dropped on us cannabis, or cancer and antibiotics. These are both huge applications that, because they weren't part of the purview of the study, I had not heard that they were happening because they're happening in private labs, like you said. That's very exciting. Is there any public research that's available? Like, you know, as somebody who's interested in both CBG and doing support for cancer patients, are there any studies out there that, or you know of taking place that are going to come out where we can read more?
Yeah, the study by Appendino on cannabigerol could be easily found on National Library of Medicine PubMed website. So that's well established, and there'll be a lot more lab studies coming out soon. And then for cancer, there are various studies. Again, if people would input on the PubMed website, cannabigerol and cancer, they'll see the various hits. But again, that's just the beginning of what we expect will be quite a number of important studies yet to come.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to talking to you about them here when they come out. Ethan, thank you so much for reaching out to me and wanting to talk about this new survey so that we can all get up to speed as this new cannabinoid becomes more common to use and more common to find.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity.
If you want to find out more about Dr. Ethan Russo, you can check out any of the other three episodes that we've had Dr. Ethan Russo for the guest ed. That will be on the page for this episode at shapingthefire.com. Also, you can check out Dr. Russo's company, Credo Science, which is credo-science.com. It's a company that is delving into some of the areas that Dr. Russo has found to be most attractive over his, over 25 years of studying the cannabis plant. And then finally, if you want to reach out to Dr. Russo yourself with a question or a comment, you can always reach him at ethanrusso@comcast.net. And if you do write to Ethan, just be aware that he is still researching and he's still publishing, and it may take him a while to get back to you, but he does try to get back to everybody eventually. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original.
You need something built. It's around. Stone needed. Preparing. Catapult ready, my lord. Preparing. Bien. Solution. Capitularia. Excellent. Alfa resultado. La manifestación. Capitularia. Stone needed. Preparing. الحصان سريع.
A message from the wolf.
I'll give you that. Excellent. My lord, we are gone.
الحصان سريع.
Recruits needed, sire.
الحصان سريع.
الشفرة حادة. خيولنا سريع. بأمرك. سموكم. Stone needed. هدفنا المسيرة الطويلة. المسيرة الطويلة. الحصان سريع.
Recruits needed, sire.
Stone needed.
Need some muscle.
Calculating. 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 نحن على استعداد. Stone needed. Preparing. ننتظر.
A message from the wolf.
Feel the power. نحن أبطال. الفرس تعدو.
What?
على كل انتباه.
Here we go. Catapult ready, my lord.
نحن مستعدون. خيولنا جاهزة. هدفنا مستحيل.
Yes, boss. Move, you dogs.
A message from the wolf.
Kill me now. I will not kneel before you.
Can't place that there, my lord. We are victorious.
Még találkozunk.